Can everyone hear me? Just take a moment to turn off any devices that you might have. Or restart. Thank you so much for coming to Tivoli tonight. Tamari is here. My name is Samantha Hill. I'm the acting director of the Hannah Arendt Center for Politics and Humanities at Bard College, and it is my pleasure this evening to welcome you to Words We Live By, Poetry and Philosophy in Conversation, the inaugural event for what we hope will become an annual event and a new partnership with the Poetry Foundation, who is very generously co-sponsoring this evening's event. The Poetry Foundation works to create a more vigorous presence for poetry and culture. And I would very much like to thank Stephen Young, the program director at the Poetry Foundation, for his support. Without him, this event would not be happening this evening. Unfortunately, he couldn't be here with us. Tonight's event is also being graciously co-sponsored by the Bard Writing Program, Literature Program, and Africana Studies. And there are many other people who had their hands in the creation of this evening who could not be here: Roger Berkowitz, Thomas Veal, Thomas Barcher, and Adam Schatz. I thank them as well for their conversations and contributions. And finally, I would like to thank Murray's for offering us this lovely sanctuary space this evening, and the incredible operations director, Tina Stanton, standing at the back of the room, without whom nothing would ever happen at the Hannah Arendt Center. And the amazing team of student fellows who are also in the back, who have set up this lovely space for us this evening and made tonight possible. Thank you. The phrase, "words we live by," comes from the end of Hannah Arendt's book On Revolution. Turning to the poet and French resistance fighter René Char, Arendt wrote, "The storehouse of memory is kept and watched over by the poets, whose business it is to find and make the words we live by." The language of poetry was, for Arendt, what remained after the war, as a record of experience that could lead us away from the tyranny of ideological thinking toward a reckoning with the world as it is. Throughout her career, the language of poetry remained at the heart of her political and philosophical writing as a form of thinking that could bring illumination in dark times. For Arendt, no less than for us, this darkness encompasses political, social, economic, ecological strife, mass homelessness, and loneliness. And it is in that spirit, with a similar belief in the potential of poetry, that we've conceived this new initiative, inviting poets and philosophers to come together in conversation. I'm very humbled to introduce our speakers for this evening, and I've already apologized to them in advance for my introductions. Fred Moten, who's directly to my left, is a poet and scholar whose work includes Little Edges, the Field Trio, In the Break, the Aesthetics of the Black Radical Tradition, the Undercommons, among many others. His most recent work is Black and Blur, which is part of a trilogy called Consent Not to Be Single. And I just want to take a moment to mention that Oblong Books from Rhinebeck is located in the back, and they're offering the works of our writers this evening. Moten's work is arresting. A critical poetics that composes Black studies, critical theory, poetics, performance, and literary theory, he pushes against the cross-grained, breaking apart the various elements that appear to crystallize together, offering us a new way of hearing and seeing the world as it is rather than as we might like it to be. Playing with repetition and rhythm while contemplating questions central to political philosophy like the subject-object relation, thinkiness, judgment, and understanding, Moten's work challenges the logical rhythms of reason with the musicality of listening, pushing us to think about new possibilities for political life. Robert Gooding Williams is the founding director of the Center for Race, philosophy and social justice, and professor of philosophy in African American and African diaspora studies at Columbia University. Author of several volumes, including Zarathustra's Dionysian Modernism, Look, a Negro, Philosophical Essays on Race, Culture, and Politics, and In the Shadow of Du Bois, Gooding Williams' work pushes the limits of philosophy to confront different conceptions of politics and political conventions. Examining how race becomes common sense, Gooding Williams reorients our vision to see how assumptions about race are embedded in oppressive social and cultural practices. Working through the lenses of aesthetic theory, political philosophy, and African American political thought, his work demands that we think through the complexities of racial justice in the United States while paying attention to the particularity of language and experience. And facilitating tonight's conversation is Bard's own Anne Lauterbach, poet. I'm afraid the poets outnumber the philosophers perhaps this evening. That's my little revenge on Plato. She is the co-chair of writing in the Milton Avery Graduate School of Arts and David and Ruth Schwab Professor of Languages and Literature. Lauterbach is author of 10 poetry and prose volumes, including Before Recollection, Clamor, If in Time, or To Begin Again, and her recently published Spell. An artist with language, Lauterbach's work meditates on art, philosophy, and poetry, creating a generative grammar that reconfigures imagination. Attentive to the nuances of the political and necessity of complexity in considering injustice and democracy, Lauterbach's writing cultivates a nourishing space for creative tension that reveals the subversiveness of poetry. Please join me in welcoming our very distinguished speakers. All yours.
Thank you so much for the great introduction. It's a pleasure to be here. And especially a pleasure to be here with Anne and Bob. I'm supposed to take 20 minutes, so I'm not going to talk too much beforehand. There's this whole weird ritual of apologizing for what I'm about to do, but I don't have time to do that today. So I'm reading from a new book that will be out in the fall called All That Beauty. And it's a kind of weird, it's trying to blur the boundaries between poetry and criticism, I guess. And it's very much influenced by many thinkers, but two in particular, James Baldwin and W.E.B. Du Bois. And so a couple of these pieces respond especially to them. So I'll start with a Preparatory Note, which is the first piece in the collection. And it's got 3 epigraphs that are pretty long from Baldwin. Okay. A Preparatory Note. About my interests, I don't know if I have any, unless the morbid desire to own a 16mm camera and make experimental movies can be so classified. That's from Notes of a Native Son. When I was very young and was dealing with my buddies in those wine and urine-stained hallways, something in me wondered, what will happen to all that beauty? For black people, though I am aware that some of us, black and white, do not know it yet, are very beautiful. And when I sat at Elijah's table and watched the baby, the women, and the men, and we talked about God's or Allah's vengeance, I wondered, when that vengeance was achieved, what will happen to all that beauty then? It's the fire next time. My father said during all the years I lived with him that I was the ugliest boy he had ever seen, and I had absolutely no reason to doubt him. But it was not my father's hatred of my frog eyes which hurt me, this hatred proving in time to be rather more resounding than real. I have my mother's eyes. When my father called me ugly, he was not attacking me so much as he was attacking my mother. No doubt, he was also attacking my real and unknown father. And I loved my mother. I knew that she loved me, and I sensed that she was paying an enormous price for me. I was a boy, and so I didn't really too much care that my father thought me hideous. So I said to myself, this judgment nevertheless was to have a decidedly terrifying effect on my life. But I thought that he must have been stricken blind, or was as mysteriously wicked as white people, a paralyzing thought, if he was unable to see that my mother was absolutely beyond question the most beautiful woman in the world. So here now was Betty Davis on that Saturday afternoon in close-up over a champagne glass, Popeyes popping. I had caught my father not in a lie, but in an infirmity. For here, before me, after all, was a movie star, white. And if she was white and a movie star, she was rich, and she was ugly. I felt exactly the same way I felt just before this moment or just after when I was in the street playing and I saw an old, very black and very drunk woman stumbling up the sidewalk, and I ran upstairs to my mother to make my mother come to the window and see what I had found. You see? She's uglier than you, Mama. She's uglier than me. Out of bewilderment, out of loyalty to my mother, probably, and also because I sensed something menacing and unhealthy, for me certainly, in the face on the screen, I gave Davis's skin the dead white greenish cast of something crawling from under a rock. But I was held, just the same, by the tense intelligence of the forehead, the disaster of the lips. And when she moved just like a nigger. Eventually, from a hospital bed, she murders someone, and Spencer Tracy takes the weight to Sing Sing. In his arms, Davis cries, and the movie ends. What's going to happen to her now? I asked Bill Miller. We don't know, said Bill, conveying to me nevertheless that she would probably never get over it, that people pay for what they do. That's from The Devil Finds Work. The truth to which criticism has access fades to blur, and we're sorry for our reckless scrutiny. But the study that soils transparency and the rightful belief that it reveals an opacity that's always there need offer no apology to James Baldwin, since it's he who teaches us to look so closely that we see all dark through what we see. Criticism is supposed to let you see through that. Criticism is poetry in this regard. And in this regard, Baldwin is more plus less than either critic or poet or both. He makes us let us look for ourselves and through ourselves till we're beside ourselves. To be beside ourselves with wholly looking is to practice Baldwin's selflessness, which is only his to give away in demanding that we see through him too, in pursuit of impure, eccentric feud, rather than the chaste satisfaction that's said to live in one-on-one relation. Fugitive in small groups, dispossession flays the pair's impossible monogamy and folds to nothing, where there are no things. Such movement intimates black indecision, which is given in the setting of the scene, which incompletes, unsettles, and upsets the scene. It's inappropriate and inappropriable. Ain't no grasping presence to be grasped, no endless fight for standing to withstand, just this anaproprioceptive falling into tangled discourse felt review. Such movement intimates black metaphysics, almost. All in transport all the way up in here, way out from here, where Harlem is nowhere, in passage, the indexical play of observer and observed, theorist and theorized, dreamer and dreamed, ebbs and topographical caress. Glistening, unheld in gazing, intricate toward gala, neither here nor there we go, down at the cross. The more we read all that beauty, the more unreadable we are. Transparency tries to hide a grammatical black hole, a spiraling refusal of singularity that flares us into visionary company. It all has to do with it, his apposition in the scene, his deposition of scenography. He brings us with what he is and sees, which is us, or we're brought with them in what he's not and sees through. That embrace, the ecstatic terrain of all that beauty, is Baldwin's function. He's like a telephonic switch in a telephoto lens, seeing doubly seen through, sounding life but seen with too, as if 3 and more plus less, mass found in variable densities of blessing, gliding, jimmying them is studied. Todo mundo te portela, foretelling, divining that confabulous, alchimeric way we move in camera. His is the eye through which the scene he's in is seen. He stays there like a loving machine, but on the way, his eyes not now his own and being seen through by the others who can't see, but somehow see the fate of all that beauty. All this turbulence comes with that, which is so emphatically not this, subverting by subverting some kind of living in our terribleness with hard, delicate, extra retrospection. Derivative of this in its egocentric particularity, that drifts in crowded, nervous torpor. Those hallways go everywhere but gone, but something else is held in something being held off in the making, bending, crumpling of a dislocation where bodies are and have no bodies. The nearly metaphorical errancy of that is there to let us know he doesn't merely look at us, he looks on us, and in that burden we are covered and unenframed. We live where you and I can't live, which is the truth of all that beauty, which we protect and convey as lovers. Where do you get eyes to see all that like that? Against the grain of the Father's desperate and uncertain cruelty, which he never ceased writing about and trying to understand and forgive and indeterminate. Baldwin is mama's baby all along. Look at how he sees through himself in Betty Davis' eyes. What's going to happen to her now? What will happen to all that ugly beauty then? What happens when we murmur, throng, and shudder? There's a word sheaf arrayed in morbid experimental want, a wet atonal burst of seasoned speech as if in every gaze lay the molten structure of another language. All that enchevêtrement so sharp, so fly, so undivisible, you have to put your sunglasses on so you can feel it, like Elizabeth Eckford. The Little Rock Nine and the Harlem Six and the Little Rock Nine of Harlem swing those wine and urine-stained hallways, and in preoccupied company, Clute twirls revisionary nightsticks. That's our braille and brushed prosaics. Our shedding sheds the portrait and the sharding of the mirror, till here come the earth in threads of flesh, its nature having risen, its finger optic love come down, hand and eye uncoordinate but social and unbearably inseparable. Relation slides in monkish transposition. Cenobitic sight off-sight, exogamous insight flown off the handle, unowned, unsightable, dispersively excited, exotic jam, all exit, all the time, in cineballet shaded glance, grave, ungraven, unworldly, cause we're too from the good black dirt, index the unarranged, frayed and arabesque, pointing, fringing back at its own heart, which brings on the juice of our broken flesh, our little broken flasha, our blurred and burrowed, unoriented surface. The wine, the blood, the shot, the scene, all dance. Oh man, it's all a kind of miracle. Down here with us because he looks like us, because he looks like her. They tell us how to look like them so we can reach through us to what we share. Okay, so how long did I go? I think I better Okay, I'll read one more thing. And this is the one that is inspired in part by Du Bois and also by Langston Hughes. And so there are two paragraphs, or two epigraphs. The first is from Langston Hughes' poem, The Weary Blues, where he writes at the very beginning of the poem, droning a drowsy syncopated tune, rocking back and forth in a mellow croon, I heard a Negro play. The second epigraph is from Du Bois's essay, Sociology Hesitant. He writes, as, however, we rise in the realm of conduct, we note a primary and a secondary rhythm. A primary rhythm depending, as we have indicated, on physical forces and physical law. But within this appears again and again a secondary rhythm, which, while presenting nearly the same uniformity as the first, differs from it in its more or less sudden rise at a given tune. 1. How can violence be such a balm? The criminal animation of a more than natural law, anageridical movement in theater's interstitial space, an experimental acting out of anchoritic cell and cause. The secret life of things is open, made plain, phenomenal ding hiss, this thing we are, all these things we are, all this, all we keep trying to get to, all we can't get back to, all miles ahead and nothingness is all that's left. Maybe the problem is simply looking at, which is to say listening to. How can you show the out-circularity of that perception? Its difficult pleasures of return and syntax, its embedded, imperceptible hesitations in miniature seismic events, its pulsive touches, its dis plus hyperlexic scratches and scars. 2. What is slave language? What's it mean to be published? Does displacement make me play the agent of my displacement, or does it let me murder my idea? What if lyric poetry regurgitates identity? Then Phyllis Wheatley is fresh and flesh, and fly is rumination syndrome. Psyche is the residue of her indigestion, which is nurture. Rumination wanders, a resuscitative essay on the run, but you never get there. All that heavy Plymouth plantation peculiarity, voluntary, involuntarily on trial, on edge, over the edge, and curved and scooped, sloped, depressive, manic. T is musical, a one-note, one-pulse percussive flight of emphatic dig, like I ain't going anywhere. Authentic mantic gesture is I and I ain't going nowhere. Who you looking at falls to where you looking from, when you looking. Ask and you can cut when and where. You cannot remember where or when. You can trace the genealogy of Baldwin's eyes with a little piece of rough silk to get the tactile sense of something going on. It's like Chile cussing out Siri again. It's like when Arendt writes to Jaspers, I've begun so late, really only in recent years, truly to love the world. Within a certain relegation to the private, given in the form of rescue, this can only be expressed in a sealed envelope or whispered with deviant love to your rose gold avatar. Baldwin says there's something ironic and violent and perpetually understated in Chile's speech. It's something tart, authoritative, and double-edged. Something you hear whenever you hear a Negro play like Langston. It's almost like being in love for those who have never been covered or born in distress or have no total sociological hitch, no quantum sociological pause, no subatomic subspace slide. 3. Feeling, sweet feeling drops from my fingertips. The tips imagine auto-excessive caress and come from that imagining. They dance into the scene, and the difference in dancing through seeing is inseparable. Hearing saves the place it makes by changing. They prepare a table by twisting, stretching, and wrinkling. Gluing and tearing can't be excluded from remorseless working. What it is to taste mass in the heart of eccentricity. What it is, celebration shot down, unburied, unrisen, listening and looking, hearing and seeing, till one another fly away. I wish I could caress, turn myself off and go on down. 4. Used to run into this kid at Doe. We'd be browsing the stacks on the top floor, looking at books that explore the frontier between mathematics and philosophy, circling ideas of mathematical existence or notions concerning the reality of mathematical objects, courting Black study where continuity, compactness, connectedness, the active sounding of our spooky distancing, nearing, overlap is a way of walking down the street in love. If there's that divinatory thinking that Oscar Becker calls mantic phenomenology, then maybe there's a mantic disposition that puts the phenomenological consensus out on the floor, turning, like never to return. What's the relation between fugitive monasticism and the paradisiacal garden? What's the relation between the paradisiacal garden and a hard road of hope? What's the difference between Moses the Black and Black Moses? What's the difference between Harriet Tubman and Isaac Hayes? Is the theft of stolen moments some new asceticism? Is there an aesthetics of the transubstantial feast? Our odious lingering was erotopology by an ice blue stream, like shelves of noise in curve and recess, like the continual forming of a pit. When people move, they move topologically and topographically, meditating through the duet towards zero, the open cell. It's not that zero comes first, it's that it comes to fuck first up. Hey Tosh, hey Josh, form a pit of iterative presences in a field, grass cat tapped down in swirled squares, little phantasmagoric agoras of rubfall. Earth makes place through world, where we hold, where study, strain through set logic, stack cruising, till after 30 years, he whispers, Zalaman. 5. A drum is a woman's club. All the symbols are double envelopes and difference engines, bringing in the sheaves of palm and olive, the innumerable bundles of ointment and anointment that render every unit Sicilian and impure, mouths filled with the south and streams, coming virtually through themselves like murmuring birds that get here before they leave there, which they theorize as a new bouquet, a newspaper called The Mystery, a project taking shape and losing it, giving shape away with sharp turns and jumped back homotopic kisses off schedule, margins at the center of their thought, which gloriously falls to preserve all that sheavy breath in lapsed concentration by deforming it, like a quartet for the end of time's live stream. And where matter is present in nothing, like a fade of portraits, leaps in and through the leaves, in the surrealization of its seriality, Daniel Ham announces a method for the torture of mothers. Black ink is blues blood in manifold, breeze blood in imaginary axes, phase systems out of spiritual linen, rhythm sections out of silk, some pulse fabric and caressive trap field in a bruised description of this skein, of this continuity, silk, animated, exhausted, like a choir come out of paper in a reading from the Book of Thunder, streams in the mouth of Florida and more, biscuits of air let go in bursts of hand shear, sheaves of sheaves raised up like leavened stone. Don't cite Black women, recite Black women, their doubt percussion, their sister tour, their heavy water. 6. That's the communicability of the shoe. Rather, he made himself nothing by taking the very nature of a servant, being made in human likeness, in the whipping machine, through its power to individuate. They kill him every day and grace is everywhere in fasting. The fluorescent asceticism of the sheep. Giving is everything and more, that's all. That's all. The exhaustive communicability of the shoe. He was blessed and cursed with visitors, the terrible aestheticism of the sheaf. They came with plates and tea in the name of the Crenshaw Legal Clinic. They came as violent, lonely mothers. The essential habit of assembly in a blue concert, the fleet communicability of the shoe. The tortured imperative to rest in power, primordially empty spaces in the mix. Come levy rents here if you can. The perfect astigmatism of the sheaf. What harmonizes things and what's awry in them, all sharing middle distance, nothing different, all the same, at a sudden rise in the endlessly arrhythmic way we stave off starving. That's the communicability of the shoe.
Let me just begin by saying thanks to Sam and Tina, Fred and Ann, and also by saying that I'm honored, enormously honored to be here, and especially to be in dialogue with Fred Moden, whose poetry and criticism and philosophy is extremely engaging and to my mind, an extraordinarily important contribution to contemporary thinking about Black studies and what, to use his phrase, Black study. Fred's thought is writing of which all of us, I think, right now ought to be deeply engaged. So I'm going to begin with Du Bois, and eventually come to some other things, including Fred's work. The first section of my remarks is entitled Du Bois's Argument Against Pessimism. In A Beauty and Death, a chapter of Darkwater, which was published in 1919-1920, Du Bois presents an argument meant to show that the perception of beauty can defeat the temptation to pessimism, what I shall call the anti-pessimism argument. This is his first hint at the argument, non-quoting Du Bois. Pessimism is cowardice. The man who cannot frankly acknowledge the Jim Crow car as a fact and yet live and hope is simply afraid either of himself or of the world. There is not in the world a more disgraceful denial of human brotherhood than the Jim Crow car of the southern United States. But to just as true, there is nothing more beautiful in the universe than sunset and moonlight on Montego Bay in far Jamaica. And both things are true and both belong to this world, and neither can be denied. In these remarks and elsewhere, Du Bois conceptualizes cowardice as a fear-induced slinking and crouching withdrawal from the world. Cowardice is pessimism in something like Schopenhauer's sense of the term. In essence, a manifest resignation of the will to live and hope. A white supremacist social order demanding that blacks ride Jim Crow can all too easily inspire pessimism among them. But Du Bois argues blacks' exposure to natural beauty, exemplified, he suggests, by the sunset and moonlight on Montego Bay, can fend off the spirit of resignation that Jim Crow too often induces, effectively restoring and sustaining the will to hope and live, the will to live and hope. But how is that possible? How is that possible? In what follows, I want to fill in what is missing from Du Bois's argument as I have sketched it so far. Namely, one, his understanding of what we perceive when we perceive beauty, and two, his understanding of the impact of the perception of beauty on human subjects. I then turn to Moden. So what do we perceive when we perceive beauty? I'm going to talk a little bit about Kant, and then about Santayana, and then I'm going to come to Du Bois. So first, Kant. In aesthetic judgment, and this is kind of summarizing tons of pages from the third critique, in aesthetic judgment, the judgment of beauty, an object comes into view as subjectively purposive, that is, as purposive for the lawful free play of the imagination. That is, the object elicits a lawful free play of the imagination, and I, the subject, feel that it is eliciting my mental activity not by chance, not by happenstance, but as if it had been designed and meant to elicit it. I judge the object, and the object appears to me to be fitted or suited to the cognitive activity of judgment. That's Kant on aesthetic judgment. Now, Santayana, I think influenced by Kant, but also Du Bois's teacher. The satisfaction of our reason, due to the harmony between our nature and experience, is partially realized already. The sense of beauty is its realization. When our senses and imagination find what they crave, when the world so shapes itself or so molds the mind, so that the correspondence between them is perfect, the perception is pleasure, and existence needs no apology. The duality, which is the condition of conflict, disappears. Here, Santayana's idea is that the sense of beauty obtains when the mind perceives the world as fitted or suited. Santayana also says congenial. When the mind perceives the world as fitted or suited or congenial to satisfying our reason by fulfilling the cravings of the senses and the imagination. Notwithstanding differences between Kant and Santayana, Santayana echoes Kant in tying the sense of beauty to the feeling that the world is fitted to and accords with the exercise of our cognitive faculties. For Santayana, our reason, for Kant, our power of judgment. Now Du Bois. In the essay to which I alluded earlier, of Beauty and Death, Du Bois writes, "Beauty is fulfillment, it's satisfied, it is always new and strange." Or Du Bois sometimes says, unexpected. It is the reasonable thing. Its end is death, the sweet silence of perfection. Therein is the triumph of beauty. Du Bois too ties the sense of beauty to the feeling that the world is fitted to and accords with the exercise of our cognitive faculties. Reminiscent of Santayana in particular, he suggests that the sense of beauty obtains when we perceive the world as fitted to the exercise of our reason. For beauty, he says, is the reasonable thing. But unlike Santayana, Du Bois regards beauty as one, new, strange, and unexpected, and two, as essentially transient, as ending in death. In short, Du Bois seems to hold that we perceive nature as beautiful and thus as fitted to the exercise of our reason, just insofar as we perceive events belonging to nature as unexpected and transient. So how does the perception of beauty impact the subject who perceives beauty? What is the impact on the subject of the perception of beauty? And I'm asking that question with respect to Du Bois now. And here I want to read another section from Du Bois's essay, in which he actually describes his perception of the beauty of the sunset on Montego Bay in far Jamaica. The sun prepared to cross that awful border which men call night and death marshals his hosts. I seem to see the spears of mighty horsemen flash golden in the light. Empurpled banners flame afar, and the low thundering of marching hosts thrills with the thunder of the sea. Athwart his own path, swinging a face of fire, he throws cloud masses, masking his trained guns. And then the miracle is done. The host passes with roar too vast for human ear, and the sun is set, leaving the frightened moon and blinded stars. That was Du Bois. There's always something new, strange, and unexpected, something miraculous, Du Bois tells us, about the sunset on Montego Bay. And that sunset, no matter how many times we have seen it, is essentially transient. For as soon as it occurs, it has all but ceased to occur, and the miracle is done. There is more to say, of course, because Du Bois depicts the transient and unexpected event of the sunset as the culmination of a grand military drama in which the personified sun marshals his hosts and directs their spears amidst purple banners. The point of Du Bois's depiction, I propose, is poetically to express the imposing and arresting feeling of subjective purposiveness, the sense of beauty, that gripped him as he observed the sunset. To echo the postscript to Darkwater, the point is poetically to pay tribute to beauty. For Du Bois, then, perceiving the Montego Bay sunset as beautiful is a matter of perceiving its ever-surprising, ephemeral, plum-colored crossing of the border between day and night as perfectly fitted to his cognitive faculties, his reason. Observing the bay and the moonlight in the aftermath of the sunset, Du Bois expresses this perception of what Santayana called a harmony between our nature and our experience. Du Bois writes, above the calm and gold-green moon, beneath the wind-wet earth, and here alone, my soul, enchained, enchanted. We are now in a position to make sense of what Du Bois writes when he describes the impact on him of his perception of Montego Bay's beauty, and thus to make sense of his belief that the perception of natural beauty can fend off the spirit of resignation that the Jim Crow car too often induces, and thus restore and sustain the will to live and hope. This is what Du Bois writes. From such heights of holiness, men turn to master the world. He's writing the aftermath of his description of his experience in Montego Bay. From such heights of holiness, men turn to master the world. All the pettiness of life drops away, and it becomes a great battle before the Lord. His trumpet, where does it sound and whither? I go. I saw Montego Bay at the beginning of the World War. The cry for service as high as heaven, as wide as human feelings, seemed filling the earth. What were petty slights, silly insults, paltry problems, beside this call to do and dare and die? Here Du Bois suggests the perception of natural beauty engenders a radical shift in perspective. So grand, so imposing, so arresting is the perception of the sun's transient and miraculous descent behind the horizon. Du Bois finds himself suddenly prompted to regard his life in a new light, to see it as part of a magnificent, morally compelling drama, a great battle before the Lord. Considered in that perspective, the petty slights and insults he has suffered under Jim Crow fall from view. They drop away. And whatever Du Bois may have felt of the cowardly temptation to give in to the spirit of resignation now evaporates. Du Bois now stands prepared to do rather than retreat from life, but also to dare and die. To dare because the perception of beauty reminds him that the world harbors miracles, that to act is to brave the unexpected, what he elsewhere calls the tingling challenge of risk. To die because the perception of beauty reminds him that transience is essential to the beauty of the great lives and acts that comprise great battles. So now I'm not completely putting Du Bois aside, but I'm going to begin talking a bit about Fred's work. And I'm going to begin by talking a bit about some of what Fred says about Du Bois. In an unpublished essay that Fred has kindly shared with me, entitled Manic Depression / Mantic Disposition, a Poetics of Hesitant Sociology / Black Topological Resistance, he explicitly brings his theory of poetry, his poetics, into conversation with Du Bois, and specifically with Du Bois's 1905 contribution to the philosophy of science, Sociology Hesitant. In that essay, Du Bois affirms a thesis that I'll read in a moment, but this is one of the essays to which Fred alludes to in one of the epigraphs, to one of the poems he read, Sociology Hesitant. So in that essay, Du Bois affirms the thesis that ours, quote, is a world of chance as well as law, that the conservation of energy and correlation of forces are not universally true, but that out of some unknown nowhere burst miraculously now and then controlling energy. Now, for my present purposes, this claim is significant. Du Bois's remark is significant for two reasons. First, because it shows that Du Bois's belief that the world harbors inexplicable, unexpected, miraculous phenomena that exceed explanation in terms of the laws, rules, and rhythms that science identifies, is deeply rooted in the hesitant sociology he articulated some 15 years before he sketched his aesthetics into beauty and death. And second, the second reason, that the claim is significant for my purposes. The second reason is that Moten, echoing Du Bois, ties his poetics and his aesthetics to Du Bois's endorsement of this belief. It is not unfair, I think, to read Moten as reading Du Bois against Kant, and specifically against Kant's claim that poetry is the business of the understanding. If the imagination is left to its lawless freedom, its wings unclipped by the regulatory jurisdiction of the understanding, then its yield will be nonsense, not poetry, or so Kant argues. Invoking Du Bois to counter this argument, Moten writes that hesitant sociology is studious inhabitation of lawlessly dispersive and disversive imagination, where presence is given not so much in the absence of meaning, but in the non-reduction of non-meaning when it has been taken for absence. Further elaborating this conception of hesitant sociology, Moten insists both that it hesitates interminably before the terms and concepts that assume and then speak, and then seek to grasp and regulate an object, and that hesitant sociology, is animated by what it studies and studies what it practices, namely that blackness disrupts traditional understandings of meaning and being. Finally, and I'm quoting Moten again, just as blackness's para-ontological nature, its tendency to disrupt traditional understandings of meaning and being, just as blackness's para-ontological nature can be said to confound philosophy, so does its extra-semantic nature confound regulatory poetry. Hesitant sociology is an attempt to think the imbrication of blackness and poetry in the ongoing moment and irreducible materiality of their conception as social life in the making, end of quotation. Moten's notion of hesitant sociology comprises a multiplicity of insights that he elaborates elsewhere, to which I cannot do justice here. Focusing on his engagement with Du Bois, however, I highlight some key propositions. First, that Moten takes Du Bois's attunement to miraculous phenomena that exceed explanation in terms of scientific laws to entail a more general attunement to phenomena that exceed traditional understandings of meaning and being, whether in the form of regulatory poetry or in the form of an ontology, in other words, a theory of the categories that constitute the being of beings. Second, that Moten takes blackness to be one of these phenomena, one of these miraculous phenomena, and so attributes to it a para-ontological nature. Third, that for Moten, the presence of blackness is the ongoing repeated confounding and disruption of traditional understanding. Fourth, that to inhabit this ongoing repeated confounding and disruption of traditional understandings, to find oneself amidst a practice of social life that is animated by a lawlessly dispersive and dispersive imagination. For Moten, if not for Kant, poetry. For Moten, finally, the poetics of hesitant sociology is itself a form of poetry, at least on my reading of this work, and belongs to the practice it studies. It is, quote, the simultaneous imagining, making, and preservation of social space in distress, under duress, a movement from manic depression to mantic disposition that parallels, I wish to suggest, the movement Du Bois charts from pessimism to the will to live. Again, the will to do, to dare, and die. It follows from this line of argument that I just summarized, by the way, that blackness, as Moten understands it, is not an attribute shared by all black people. Although, as Moten writes elsewhere, echoing Heidegger on Dasein's relation to being, black people are privileged insofar as they are given to an understanding of it. This claim suggests that in understanding blackness, blacks may feel that blackness is fitted or suited to their understanding, if not to our traditional understandings of meaning and being. And I want to talk a little bit about Moten on Baldwin and on art and beauty. So Baldwin, beauty, and art. I turn now briefly and inadequately to Moten's engagement with James Baldwin, and I'm going to be talking about some of what he wrote in the preparatory note, as well as about some of what he writes in one of the essays in The Universal Machine. I'm going to be turning to Moten's engagement with James Baldwin, and specifically to a part of his response to Hannah Arendt's response to Baldwin's Down at the Cross, Letter from a Region in My Mind, which originally appeared in The New Yorker. First, some lines from the famous ending of Baldwin's essay, which Fred has already read. When I was very young and was dealing with my bodies in those wine and urine-stained hallways, something in me wondered what will happen to all that beauty. For black people, though I'm aware that some of us black and white do not know it yet, are very beautiful. And Baldwin adds, if we, and now I mean the relatively conscious whites and the relatively conscious blacks, who must, like lovers, insist on or create the consciousness of others, do not falter in our duty now, we may be able, handful that we are, to end the racial nightmare and achieve our country. Now some lines from Arendt's letter to Baldwin. What frightened me in your essay was the gospel of love, which you begin to preach at the end. In politics, love is a stranger. And when it intrudes upon it, nothing is achieved except hypocrisy. Hatred and love belong together, and they are both destructive. You can afford them only in the private and as a people only as long as you are not free. Turning now to Moten, consider some of his remarks on Baldwin's recollection of the hallways of his youth. Baldwin's retrospection on what he wondered while he was with his buddies seems to betray with an indexical that, the detachment of an observer. But he was with them. He was looking and wondering with them, which is what allowed the beauty they shared to come into the sharing of a view. In the preparatory note to All That Beauty, from which Fred was quoting a few moments ago, he adds, Baldwin's selflessness, which is only his to give away and demanding that we see through him too, in pursuit of impure, eccentric feud rather than the chaste satisfaction that's said to live in one-on-one relation. Fugitive in small groups, dispossession flays the pair's impossible monogamy. He looks on us, and in that burden we are covered and unenframed. We live where you and I can't live. We live where you and I can't live, which is the truth of all that beauty, which we protect and convey as lovers, the wine, the blood, the shot, the scene, all dance, all man. It's all a kind of miracle. Consider too some of Moten's remarks on Baldwin's appeal to relatively conscious whites and blacks. Quoting Moten again now, the relatively conscious are covered in the explosive beauty of blackness, which is to say that this covering of one by another in small groups of relatively conscious ones and others is an upheaval not only of the regime of racial opposition, but also the metaphysics and mathematics of individuation and relation. Finally, consider some of Baldwin's remarks on Arendt's letter to Baldwin. Moten writes, Baldwin is not a political theorist. He is not concerned with political thought. When Arendt speaks disparagingly of love, she is speaking of love for a people, of the love of something peculiar to or particular in a people. But Baldwin is speaking against whatever notion of exclusivity of such beauty. I close my comments here this evening with some reflections on the sequence of lines and remarks I just quoted, and on their bearing on the charge that Fred and I talked some about the relation between philosophy and poetry, between poetry and philosophy. I begin by recalling that in Arendt's view, plurality is at once a condition constitutive of political life and a condition by means of which political life comes to be. To embrace plurality, she argues, is to repudiate the ideal of sovereign, uncompromising self-sufficiency, which is, to borrow terms that Moten borrows from Glissant, to consent not to be a single, isolate being. When Arendt takes issue with love, moreover, it is precisely because love, in the words of one commentator, ruins the condition of plurality. And love ruins that condition, Arendt argues, because love, and here it would do well to remember that Arendt's paradigm case of love is the love between two lovers, because love destroys the in-between, the worldly space between men where political matters are located. Now, whatever one says about Arendt on love, plurality, and politics, it is obvious to me that what Baldwin means by love and what he discerns in the love between lovers is not what Arendt means and discerns. Indeed, if we follow Moten's reading of Baldwin, then we might well want to say that when Baldwin uses the demonstrative, the indexical that, to position himself among his buddies, and when he invokes the truth of a miraculous and explosive beauty of blackness that is fugitive in small groups, thus eschewing the impossible monogamy of one-on-one individuation in relation, He is invoking an idea of love precisely the opposite of Arendt's. That is, an idea of love that alerts us to the sometimes wine, blood, and urine-stained scene of human plurality, or to quote Moten again, the poetic imagining, making, and preservation of social space in distress. To be sure, to read Baldwin along these lines as thinking human plurality in a distinctive way that, ironically, Arendt failed to recognize, is by no means to align him with Arendt. For example, I suspect that Baldwin, like Sheldon Wolin, like Ralph Ellison, and like Frederick Douglass, rejected the asocial understanding of the proper content of politics associated with Arendt's thought. What I do want to suggest, however, is that to read Baldwin as Moten reads him need not be to deny that he is a political philosopher or theorist. On the contrary, it may be to read him as a political thinker who expands our conception of the political, that is, of the possibilities available to human plurality, and specifically to the reimagining and remaking of a democracy, American democracy, in distress. It would be to read Baldwin as, for example, we can fruitfully read Claudia Rankine, especially her book, Citizen and American Lyric. On this view, Baldwin and perhaps Moten himself are heirs of Frederick Douglass, whose vision of the visionary company of his incendiary band of brothers sees the truth of all that beauty and sees it with love. And so I leave you with Frederick Douglass. And the passage I'm about to read comes from My Bondage and My Freedom. For much of the happiness or absence of misery with which I passed this year with Mr. Freeland, I am indebted to the genial temper and ardent friendship of my brother slaves. They were, every one of them, manly, generous, and brave. Yes, I say they were brave, and I will add, fine-looking. It is seldom the lot of mortals to have truer and better friends than were the slaves of this farm. It is not uncommon to charge slaves with great treachery towards each other and believe them incapable of confiding in each other. But I must say that I never loved, esteemed, or confided in men more than I did in these. They were true as steel, and no band of brothers could have been more loving. Thoughts and sentiments were exchanged between us, which might well be called very incendiary by oppressors and tyrants. And perhaps the time has not even now come when it is safe to unfold all the flying suggestions which arise in the minds of intelligent slaves. Thank you.
I'll just say thank you. Thank you. I'm not going to say anything else.
Really?
Well, there's a lot to take in, isn't there? I guess there's some things that are sitting around in my mind that have to do with your beginning with notions of transparency and the relation of transparency to a way of looking, and then thinking about something that I've thought of a lot in your work, and maybe this is complicated by the thinking in philosophy, in some philosophy anyway, which is this comment you make that looking at, which is listening to. And I feel in a lot of your work that part of the shift that you're making has to do with moving from visualizations in relation to judgment to listening in relation to judgment. And further, so that's a question, kind of, and also interesting when talking about the sunset in relation to poetry. And inside of all of that is a question about the notion of blur and how you imagine
blur. I don't know whether it's from Adorno or somewhere else, but blur seems to be in relation to this seeing and hearing. Is that right?
Well, yeah, I mean, well, one way to think about blur is that it troubles the sharp division between seeing and hearing. That maybe there's a way that you could imagine looking so closely at a thing that you start to hear it. And even if it is supposed to have been silent, and then in that moment of something like a kind of synesthetic moment, the division of labor of the senses is troubled, and you know, it's a kind of commonplace formulation that racialization corresponds maybe most closely to the visual sense. I mean, people call it visual pathology. So, you know, so there's a way in which, you know, you have to be able to imagine that, well, okay, so I'm imagining, so this is like a pivot, because I'm just so immersed now in my own head with Bob's essay, and I'm thinking specifically about that moment where what does the voice say, that beauty is the reasonable thing? So I was thinking a couple things. One, it's really interesting and important that it's not that the Jim Crow car is initially, it's aligned with pessimism, i.e. it is that which produces or induces pessimism, or can. And then on the other, and beauty is therefore opposed to. So there's a sense in which beauty is bound up with hope, at least, if not optimism. And the logical move to make would be to assume that ugliness would be bound up with pessimism, and the Jim Crow car would be the scene of ugliness. But then I kept thinking to myself, well, the trouble is, and this is not anything that Du Bois doesn't know. Matter of fact, his work is the primary reason, it's one of the fundamental reasons that we know this in ways that actually corresponds to what it is that Baldwin says, namely, whether some people know it or not, black people are very beautiful. If black people were on the Jim Crow car, then there was beauty in the Jim Crow car. So how do you deal with that? What it means is that beauty need not simply be located in the sunset, although it's there too. But beauty is not only in black people, but it's therefore in the Jim Crow car. Ugliness and beauty appear at that moment to be inseparable. Deeper still, given the general formulations about the relationship between beauty and reason, or beauty and rationality, that even Du Bois gives us, it would be quite easy to assume in Du Bois, and in that passage from Frederick Douglass, it's there, in what, there's a kind of vindication that's already existent in Du Bois, but certainly in Douglass, certainly in Baldwin. The black person is often conceived of precisely as the unreasonable thing, a thing because they in fact are unreasonable. So now we have to deal with the fact that beauty is not just in the car, but beauty is also the unreasonable thing. And I'm not saying any of this to just, this is all something that we can now do something with. We could work with this now, you know. Well, there's a kind of cool thing about how we can work with this, and then there's the horror and terror of a history that requires us to work with this. Like, we gotta work, this is what we gotta work with, right? And so, and one way it manifests itself is in this kind of way that, like, I can imagine sitting on that car and seeing some really beautiful old black woman, maybe the same beautiful old black woman that Baldwin describes as that beautiful, that ugly black woman that he saw when he called his mother to the window. Let's say it's her. And I can imagine looking at her and looking at her so closely till I begin to hear her or imagine that I do. And looking at her so closely that she looks at me and says, who are you looking at? What you looking at? Because we operate within a regime in which looking at black folks is very, very often a form of profound violence. So
Profound.
violence,
Yeah.
brutality, right? At which point then, it's cool because you kind of have to think, because what Baldwin does for us and what Du Bois does for us and what Douglass does and what Robert does now is he's challenging us to imagine some other modality of looking at and listening to black folks. That's what Langston Hughes is doing too. This becomes our charge, you know. But in doing so, all these categories that we have been given, they have to get messed up.
They have to get blurred. Right. Yeah. Thank you. See, this is what Fred Mountain can do. I can say something, and he can answer it, and then he can do this thing called pivot. Amazing pivot, right? And then he comes back and to the question. It's extraordinary. What do you think?
So I think a lot of things. Let me enumerate some of them. So I do think that Du Bois wants to talk about not only about natural beauty, but the beauty of human lives. That is important. And part of the point of the argument, I suppose, is to encourage his addressee, at least with respect to the argument. And I think that the addressee or the addressees of that argument are black people, and the people who have been the victims of Jim Crow. It is, on the other hand, interesting that he doesn't say, look at the beauty around you, which is, in some sense, Fred's challenge. That he makes the move to natural beauty and to, the beauty of the sunset at Montego Bay and Port Jamaica. I'm not sure what more to say about that, except to add the caveat, which Fred and others are well aware, that Du Bois himself did not always, regard massive black people, riding a Jim Crow car as beautiful. That Du Bois himself sometimes participates in a discourse that pathologizes it, degrades black people, and you can find that in his certain writings. And by the way, I think it's complicated. I mean, Du Bois is in some sense a major representative of what nowadays people call the politics of respectability. But it's important to see, for what it's worth, that this is deeply rooted in a kind of social theoretic account of the Negro problem, where the Negro problem is understood to be a function, on the one hand, of racism, racial prejudice, but on the other hand, of black backwardness. And to the extent that blacks are backward, then they don't come into view necessarily as beautiful. So that's one or 2 points. But a further point is that I do think, as I argue in a piece from which I did not read today, that Du Bois does think that beauty can have a kind of disruptive effect, that it can undermine white racism. And I think that case can be made by looking at some of the short stories in Dark Water. I mean, roughly, I think my view is something like this: that Du Bois thinks that racism is very profoundly, very deeply entrenched. So entrenched, but at least by the time he writes Dark Water, that it cannot be undone by appeals to reason or to or by adducing, evidence that might motivate, a rational subject to change his or her beliefs. So how is it to be undone? Well, it has to be undone in some sense by assault, but art can become a kind of vehicle of that assault. Art can undo people's deeply entrenched constitutive commitments. And it can do that by bringing some constitutive commitments into conflict with others. Beautiful art can do that. I think Du Bois thinks. And to explain how that works is complicated. I won't go into it now, but it bears on, if the basic idea makes sense, then I hope it's clear that there's a part of what Brad is saying, because it points to the way in which Du Bois is not only looking to beauty as a means to fend off pessimism, but as a means to disrupting, undoing the very cause of pessimism, white supremacy, white racism, the moral, what I can call kind of the moral psychology of white supremacy. And I suppose if one that were to adopt a critical perspective on Du Bois, we might even argue that there's a kind of art that can, that might be kind of functional in undoing Du Bois's own, shall we say, a perception in the spirit of a pathologizing respectability politics of folks on the Jim Crow car who he does not regard as beautiful. So it's all, so I hope, and he might regard as in fact ugly. So Du Bois is a complicated character, and I guess to summarize what I've been saying so far, there might be a way in which one could read Du Bois against Du Bois. One could take up what Du Bois' aesthetics and then with an eye to developing a critical perspective on those aspects of Du Bois' thought which we might find problematic.
Here's a question. Going back to being, this is slightly literal, I think. If the sunset is the emblem of the beautiful, it's also obviously transitory, right? Transient. And if the beautiful is an appeal to, or the harmony of reason, how do you make, and the frightened moon is about to arrive, how do you square or make it possible for the transience of beauty, which is strangeness and newness, I guess, also, with this notion that there's an appeal to reason, which seems to me to be something that thinks of itself as not so transient, having certain kinds of, right?
So, yeah, so I wouldn't want to identify the transient and the unexpected. I think they're two different features. So, I think that's a great question. I mean, what I might be inclined to say is that we shouldn't attribute to Du Bois' conception of, necessarily attribute to Du Bois' kind of conventional conception of reason. In other words, it could turn out that Du Bois is operating with, when Du Bois says that beauty is the reasonable thing, he's actually challenging a certain conventional received conception of reason that would pit reason against transience and strangeness. And yet I think it's significant that he uses that term, because it is a term I think if you read the relevant passage carefully, that term and other use of that term and other terms and what he says otherwise suggests that he is thinking about perception, that is, he's thinking about the experience of beauty. It's very hard to read the relevant passages without thinking that he's giving account of the subjective experience of beauty. I mean, just the category of the unexpected. The unexpected is always, unexpected relative to some, horizon of expectation. I think the right response to that question is to try to think carefully about, to return to Du Bois's text and to interrogate with respect to the question, what does Du Bois mean by reasonable? And that's not a question that I undertook to answer here. I mean, one thing I would say, and now I'm going to try to do a mode and then make a pivot. One thing that one might say about Du Bois that I had in the back of my mind when I was writing the remarks I delivered and thinking about Du Bois' connection to some of Fred's writings, Fred on Baldwin and so forth and so on, is that Du Bois is really thinking about the experience of beauty as an individual's experience. To be maybe a little crude and oversimplified, it's hard to read Du Bois when he's describing the sunset and then how it affects him and how it is that it compels him to dare and do it without and say, oh, Du Bois is not consenting. Du Bois is consenting not to be a single being. I mean, Du Bois, it's got a kind of heroic, let us say, valence, Du Bois's language. So one of the things that it seems to me that, although I was kind of drawing a connection between Fred's writing and what Du Bois is up to, vis-a-vis sociology hesitant and the figure of the miraculous and so forth and so on. I think there's a way in which Du Bois, often throughout his career, it remains individualist in a way that I think Fred wants to reject. So there's kind of sociology about the truth of all that beauty, which is why, in the end, although I think you were suggesting, kind of affinity between Du Bois and Douglass. The part of the point of alluding to Douglass at the end of my remarks is to suggest that maybe in Douglass there's something going on that's a little less like Du Bois and a little more like Baldwin. So when I was suggesting that Moten, maybe, and Baldwin are heirs to Douglass, on that point, right, to the extent that we're talking about a kind of sociology, perhaps a rethinking of sociality, and perhaps a rethinking of the political, I think that, yes, that applies to Douglass, but less so to Du Bois. In fact, in some of my work, I kind of argue that Du Bois is committed to a conception of politics as rule. It need not be individualistic, but whereas there's something, if you will, that resonates more with someone like Arendt in Douglass, who I think is thinking about politics more as action and concert. But in any event, there is a kind of politics of rule, but also individualism about Du Bois's thinking. The talented synthesis collection of gung-ho individuals, as distinct from Douglass's band of brothers, which is all about ardent friendship and love and a kind of being with one another that, to my mind, resonates much more well than with anything that I find in the
No, it's really, now in my mind I'm thinking, obviously, I think what you're saying is true, and that there's, in all three of those figures, there's a kind of, there's an intensity of, we maybe it's inseparable from just how much we have come to revere them, that they stand out for us as soloists, and when we think of them in that vein, and then at the same time, what we are also constantly looking for, I think, in reading all of them is we're looking for them when we want to come to them in those moments when it seems clear that they want to hang out with us. You know, you're looking for it's seldom, you know, and he's always got his suit on and his three-piece suit, and the beard is always trimmed. But if you can just find a moment in Du Bois where he wants to hang out, in that same way you can find it in that Baldwin text and in the Douglass text, and I think those moments are there. In other words, the moment where you say he's not looking at us in that violent way. He's looking with us. He's looking upon us with us. It's a very complicated. This is why the shift between this and that is so telling. You know, it's like it's not a deictic pointing like that. It's a pointing that it curves back on itself, and he's there with it. It's almost impossible to describe. You almost want to make a movie out of it, and you feel like that's why he was saying that thing. The epigraph from Notes of a Native Son. That's a cinematic moment in The Fire Next Time to me. So you're looking for those moments when they're with us, even though, and I feel like that's why I love. Well, okay, so I was thinking now, and you would know this, and I would want to ask you this for a long time. So Sociology Hesitant was from 1905. It was a speech he delivered in 1905. And in intellectual history of the 20th century, 1905 is a really special year because of the great, I guess, 3 papers that Einstein published that, you know, based the special relativity paper and the electromagnetism paper, which revolutionized physics in 1905 and sort of revolutionized everything else. And also Max Planck's work. So 1905 is this pivot point because it's the movement, it's the beginning of a movement, in crude terms, from classical mechanics to quantum mechanics. And then just as that movement is beginning to emerge and get consolidated in like Heisenberg and other people, the uncertainty principle especially, Einstein comes along again well, I don't remember exactly when it was published, I guess 1915, but it wasn't proven until 1919, or at least aspects of, well, he comes along with the general theory of relativity, which does this. So what I'm thinking is that in that relay, in that moment between, if we actually took the time to think about Du Bois and Einstein as contemporaries, when you talk about his attunement to the unexpected, to the miraculous, to the phenomenal event, it's as if in that 1905 essay, you almost want to read him as anticipating quantum mechanics. You almost want to read him as anticipating those kinds of leaps and weird, inexplicable effects in the social world that physicists are beginning to see within the subatomic frame. And I guess what I find endearing, you know, or whatever about Du Bois is he's committed to those things which he talks about as incalculable. And he sees those things in Black social life. And he sees, for him, the incalculable rhythm of human action would manifest itself, the evident rhythm of human action, the countable rhythm of human action shows up as birth rates and death rates. The incalculable rhythm of action shows up as the meaning of a women's club, right? It's in that same kind of sociality. So even in those moments, he's at least able to point to it. Or like those, you know, I was thinking.
Is that hesitancy right there?
Maybe the hesitancy, well, there's a bunch of different, I mean, I think he's saying within that essay that sociology hesitates before those modes of sociality. It doesn't know what to do with what can't show up within a certain kind of positivistic frame. And at the same time, I think what he also wants to do is to say that the hesitation is actually also in that sociality. It's a kind of syncopation. It's a rhythm, or a monk would say rhythming. You know, and in that rhythm, in that incalculable rhythm, that's where life. It's a disequilibrium, is what Schrodinger would call it, and it's that way that life avoids the fall into equilibrium. And he's invested in that, and he loves that. And I think I love him when I see him loving that.
Are we done for, can we go on, or should we ask for some contributions? You want to say something?
Well, so I wish I, had, yes, what is it? December 3rd, 1977, that was Einstein. There it is. But I don't know about if
They have correspondence later on.
but much later on, right?
Yeah, 40s.
Yeah. So, but that said, I mean, the historical moment is certainly striking and interesting. The only thing I would add is that the language of chance and unpredictability has also been located with respect to James, and James's, I think, William James's essay on determinism, his conception of indeterminism. And then also there's a 19th century, engagement with the 19th century study of probability, and the question of the way in which chance, enters into the discourse around the statistics-related discourse around probability. And again, this is not something that I know about in any detail or firsthand, but I know, for example, Peirce is an important figure in this respect. So it's a complicated historical. Let me put it the way it's a complicated intellectual historical configuration. We need to, I think, have an eye to the 19th century as well as the 20th century. And in fact, I think, the Ron Judy, in his initial discussion of the sociology hesitant essay and his introduction to it in Boundary Truth, makes, actually is cognizant of James, but actually says, and James's essay on indeterminism, that suggests that perhaps Peirce's notion of Tickism is perhaps even more pertinent to understanding. So we need to be looking back Peirce and James, as well as thinking about a chance, the category of chance, as it enters into quantum physics. Can I just ask Fred one more question?
Can I just say one thing I forgot to say?
Oh, yeah.
Because I got an email from this guy named, I think his name is Avram Alpert, and I didn't meet him. I think he teaches at Princeton. And I feel bad. I hope if he ever sees this, because I should mention it. Because he sent me an email after this talk I gave, and he was saying the same thing. And he was talking about Du Bois, not only in relation to Peirce and James, but also Dewey, who's also working on some of the same stuff and running. So, yeah, maybe it's more, the better way to put it is that Du Bois is coming on at this moment at the turn of that century. Like you say, when the question of determinism and the question of probability is emerging. And Einstein is in a certain way a kind of culmination of that, and then a movement out that. But then Du Bois follows him too in all these kind of cool ways. So, I'm sorry.
No, that's okay. No, that's great. No, yeah. I mean, I think I think it's extremely important, and it's quite striking how the category of the miraculous kind of recurs. But the question I wanted to ask is, there are these references, and I think, tell me if I'm pronouncing it correctly, in some of what you read today, but elsewhere too, Cinnabatic monks.
Yeah.
This kind of communal,
Yeah.
you know, ascetic communal. And I was wondering if you could say just a little bit more about that. And I guess I kind of looked that up and said, but I don't know anything about that particular religious tradition. And so I wonder if you could say just a little bit more about that and how it figures into your thinking about sociality as opposed to being a single man. Yeah.
Well, I had a lucky kind of accident. I was in a kind of research group for a year with this medievalist at Duke named Carolyn Berzelius, and she introduced me to some scholarship on sort of monasticism that I got really interested in, and that's when I first became aware of this distinction between the sort of anchoritic sort of monasticism, which is a kind of lonely, you know, St. Jerome in his cell or St. Anthony out in the desert, kind of by yourself, kind of, you know, monasticism, and this sort of Cenobitic monasticism of the actual monasteries, of, you know, kind of collective, you know, which very quickly becomes all about the development and the submission to rule, and which is specifically in the, you know, sort of Benedictine rule. So that's part of it, and I was fascinated by those forms of sociality, and my tendency is to want to think about, but to want to broaden that out, okay? So I think it's completely a great divine accident that maybe one of the greatest composers in Black musical tradition is Thelonious Monk. So, and when I think about the development of bebop, I think about it as a kind of, you know, kind of Black monasticism. You know, those guys hanging out, you know, at study together, you know, in Minton's Playhouse at 3 o'clock in the morning, working through these sorts of rhythmic and harmonic innovations that would produce a whole other kind of music. And Monk is a fundamental, essential part of that movement. But then I also would think about that monasticism as all bound up with Baldwin and his boys in the wine and urine stained hallways, or Douglass with his friends, you know, in the slave cabin, and it's also just part and parcel of a kind of general insurgent Black sociality. Like, there's a set of appendices, you know, to the Philadelphia Negro, one of which is this compendium of laws pertaining to the Negro that were passed and instituted in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. And one of them is what is referred to as, it's an anti-tumult law. It's outlawing the tumultuous gathering of one or more Black people in the public square on Sunday in Philadelphia. Well, why would that be? Why would you need to make that against the law? What were they doing that was so dangerous to the already existing order of things? And my sense of it seems totally rational to me to suggest that if 3 or 4 Black people got together in the public square in Philadelphia on a Sunday in 1700, at some point the question of freedom came up. That they constituted in their presence a conspiracy, but the conspiracy was nothing other than being Black in public. Now, that same conspiracy is what Douglass is referring to, right, in that passage. Well, they were doing some illicit. What were they doing that was illicit? Well, enjoying one another's company, partaking of one another's beauty, perhaps. They were thinking insurgent thoughts, you know. So that's the monasticism that I'm interested in.
Of course, one has to wonder where the women are in all of this.
And that's why when Du Bois refers to the women's club, that's part of it. But I also think that, you know, there's a massive amount of counter-insurgent, or what would we call it, meta-insurgent work, okay, that has to be done on that insurgency, right? And we were talking about, you know, Saidia Hartman's new book, and you know, part of what she's doing in this new book is she's saying, Yeah, that tendency to focus on the pantheon of great black male soloists. You know, we got to pay attention to, you know, what had been for us these wayward, nameless girls, you know, who were engaged in their own, you know, well, there's these great tradition in 13th, 14th century Dutch tradition of the Begin, you know, these sort of insurgent women's monastic religious communities. And so there's all of that too.
Yeah. Well, I was thinking about Simone White also, I think, is somebody who's trying to make a kind of corrective move or corrective understanding of that in our time. You're smiling.
Yeah, she says she doesn't want to be in the, what she said is that interview in the Los Angeles Review of Books where she just doesn't want to be part of some old man's listening club, listening to jazz. On the one hand, I don't blame her, but on the other hand, next time I get a chance to hang out with Nate Mackey, I'm just gonna be in the old man's listening club. But she's right.
Thank you both so much. I think we have a few minutes for possibility of somebody in the audience asking one or both of these gentlemen a question or making a remark. I invite you. Yes?
Thanks for the two talks. I have a question for everybody. I was really struck by your description or your focus on the transformative impact of that sunset. And I was wondering whether you could say a bit more about the conditions under which that impact can happen. And the reason I'm thinking that is because of the chapter in Souls on the coming of John, in which I think he had an optimism problem.
Oh, yes, right.
And he's like, oh my God, this is the most amazing experience I've ever had. But he says the white, bougie people sitting next to him are bored by Bob. So the same aesthetic experience, which supposedly belonged to the European humanist tradition, transforms black John and white John is too busy flirting with the woman next to him to appreciate the Bob before him.
Yeah.
Which then Du Bois is himself signaling that only under certain conditions or only certain people are going to be receptive to transformative aesthetic experiences. And I was surprised that in your talk, you didn't kind of address those sociological conditions in which a sunset would have a transformative impact on me, or just pass me over as yet another sunset. I've seen a million of these. When you go, like, earn a bunch of money or something. And so I was hoping you could just say a bit about where you see Du Bois standing on that question of when we're actually receptive to those kinds of experiences.
Yeah, that's a great, can you hear me? That's a great question. And I don't know that I have a good answer. But let me do some context setting for those who don't necessarily know the passages from Souls to which you alluded. So, Souls of Black Hole includes a single short story entitled Of the Coming of John Jones. He comes from a small town, Altamaha, I think it's in Georgia. And then he goes away, gets educated. He doesn't want to go home. He goes to New York, and when he goes to New York, he goes to a performance of Lohengrin, which, by the way, I think was Du Bois's favorite opera. Somewhere, I think in an essay in the Pittsburgh Courier, he says, in the 30s, he says that he saw Lohengrin 14 times. Anyway, he's at the opera, and lo and behold, next to him is a woman and his childhood friend. Nobody has recognized anybody. He's listening to the swan song. He's listening to the swan song motif in the what would we call it? The prologue. What's the proper term? The musical.
The overture.
The overture. He's listening to the overture. And at some point he moves his arm and he touches, elbows, the white woman next to him. And turns out that, that before you know it, so he's moved, as you pointed out, he's moved by the music. And the ushers come and the ushers, escort him away because he's, made physical contact with the white woman. But on the way out, he recognizes that this guy, this white guy, is his childhood friend, and there's a gesture to to shake hands, but then they don't quite do it. Later, at the end of the opera, when he's about to be lynched, in a moment that I read as a moment of resignation, he's whistling. And it's just thinking about it, it's amazing. He has this protagonist as he's about to be lynched, whistling or humming the song of the bride from Lohengrin. So lots of social context there. The opera, anxieties about miscegenation, lynching, and then when we come to Darkwater, Du Bois gets to go, on vacation. I mean, in some sense, I think this resonates with Fred's works. I mean, who gets to go to, you tell me I'm kind of, I'm in a mode of resignation, because, after I deal with Jim Crowbar. And then you say, well, go to Judea. Well, and watch the sunset, then you'll be, renewed. Well, I can't, I barely get enough money to, ride the Jim Crow car every day. So, I mean, that's a social, there's a kind of, I guess we could start thinking in terms of Bourdieu or something, or, you begin thinking about the way in which class and class position, animates and conditions, a set response, the way in which we kind of forget the sociological context and then kind of treat certain aesthetic responses as available to us, qua, human subject, Without seeing that, what you're doing is you're kind of, generalizing something that's, class specific. And Sylvia Winter, I mean, lots of people have written about this, building on Bourdieu, but so it's she's got a really interesting account that tracks along these lines. So that said, in a kind of critical spirit, maybe a Du Boisian response would be that if you really sit with the sunset, wherever you are, and I think Du Bois has to be committed to something like this in order for it to make sense. There's always something new and unexpected about the mystery of the sunset, about the miracle of the sunset. And I was thinking about that, and I don't think that's quite anybody who's seen actually sat and let his or their soul be enchained, and enchanted by this. Once might do it again and say, amazing. Yeah, and so it can happen more than once, right? It's not the sort of thing. Of course, you could distance yourself and you could say, okay, let me go back to my Copernicus and kind of see and tell you the laws that explain, why this is. Yeah, but there is something compelling, right, about the descent of the sun below the horizon, and there's something, and part of what makes it compelling whenever it occurs. I mean, this is trying to argue the point where, the anti-Bourdieuian, defending, now I'm arguing in a Du Boisian, trying to defend Du Bois. There is something potentially universal about that experience. So, but it's not only that there's something kind of miraculous about it, it's also that, and this is, I think, also extremely interesting and important, it's transient. And thinking about this, it made me realize that I kind of need to revisit all those, references to dusk and dawn in Du Bois. Dusk and dawn, from souls through, dusk at dawn, is kind of all over the place. I mean, and there are other passages in A Beauty and Death where Du Bois is very much engaged with when he goes into the Grand Canyon, there's this kind of epiphany. It's a very weird kind of thing that I still don't completely understand, but there's this kind of epiphany, only it obtains at sunrise, not sunset, but dusk, dawn. I mean, it's this moment of transient, the rising of the sun, the appearance of the sun, or the dawning of the sun, or the setting of the sun. And I guess I think that in his view, I think he believed that experiences of that sort had a kind of power that was available, to anyone and everyone, regardless of social position. Arguing the point that this kind of good.
Well, I thank you very much for your erudition. And I have to say that a lot of what I've heard tonight is kind of difficult for me to process, just at an intellectual level. And so I take away with me the struggle in a positive sense. Something to continue to look into, continue to wrestle with. And I thank you for that. And there was also a very simple statement that Simone shared, and I think it also relates to this gentleman's question about the conditions that have to be in place to really appreciate it. And I think you said in relation to W.E.B. Du Bois, that I love him when he loves that. Am I quoting you somewhat correctly? And the point that I took from that was that there was a kind of there was a connection that happened, and that connection had something to do with harmony. Something to do with an openness that perhaps was unexpected and surprising and wonderful when it happened. But that those qualities of being open and the unexpected, and I don't know, you used the word love, and I appreciated that came in there. I don't know exactly how to characterize that big word in the time that we have. Just a comment, and if you have anything further to say about that, I would love to hear it.
Thank you. Well, it's funny. I mean, I'm thinking, that formulation that Arendt makes in the letter to Baldwin, that in politics, love is a stranger, and love is often a stranger in academia too. Now, so what happens when love comes in, so to speak? Or we were talking on the train today, and you were talking about very beautiful way you noticed that phrase, which I had read 1,000 times but hadn't got stopped by yet. It's just something in me, Baldwin says. Something in me wonders. That something in me, seems to me still that when you say something about something in you, it's as if you're referring to something that came into you from someplace else, right? Something something struck you, or something happened to you. So you were disrupted or invaded, or you left yourself vulnerable or open to something, and that something happened to you. A passion occurred, so I felt like what you were saying, Bob, about to think of Baldwin as a political theorist, which I'm reluctant to do, but I see why you do it, and because something happens to political theory when Baldwin comes in. you know, when love walks in the room, you know, so to speak. And I think something happens in Du Bois when love comes into play, even if he doesn't have to openly declare it for you to be able to feel it or see it. And it really is that thing where you're like, you know, the history that he lived and that he was embedded in and that we are still living and that we are still embedded in. Well, I was going to say I was going to say it includes something, but I feel like it's stronger than that to say that it includes something. I also want to say that I want to really say that it is grounded on something, but I don't know which one is. I think it's closer to grounded than it is to include, okay? So I was going to say that the history we live in is grounded in many ways on the disregard and hatred, you know, of certain people. So when you can feel in Du Bois's, you know, work, the love, okay, of those people, it's a deep thing. Now that's interesting because it connects up with that formulation that Arendt says in the letter to Baldwin too. She's talking about the love of people. And there's this moment where you say, well, it's really deep and it's really important that Du Bois, that you feel at this moment that Du Bois loves black people, that he considers black people to be lovable in a world that generally doesn't believe that and often seems to be structured by that disbelief. But then there's this other thing that you're saying, I think, Bob, by way of Kant, or it's a Kantian formulation. The way I think of it is by way of, you know, an important commentator on Kant, and particularly Kant's aesthetics, is this guy, Paul Geyer. And the phrase he uses is the intersubjective validity of judgments of taste. That's what Du Bois is getting at with the sunset. And it's like you say, I can see that this is beautiful. And when I say that this is beautiful, I am filled with the conviction that it is just beautiful for everybody. And that is a fundamentally, like an absolutely clear, irreducible statement of universality. And the interesting question is, how does that how that both affirms the love of black people, precisely insofar as black people are people who can also see the sunset and know that it is beautiful, and it is also an affirmation of a certain notion of universality. And I do feel like, and maybe this is the tricky part, that, and this would be a Sylvia Wynter formulation maybe, that any formulation about universality that operates by way of the exclusion of these particular people from it, okay, should constitute for us a reason to call into question that particular statement about universality in the interest of trying to achieve an actual, genuine universality, right? It's, in other words, there's maybe in Baldwin, I think, and certainly in Du Bois, and I feel like in Douglass, and I feel like pretty much I want to adhere to this myself. Any formula, any universal judgment, that universal judgments which proceed by way of the exclusion of a people become occasions for us to call into question the legitimacy of those judgments in the interest of the building of an actually legitimate universal formulation. So, and I feel like that's part of what he's invested in with that statement about the natural beauty. It's a thing that maybe there's a reason why you would talk about it in terms of the sunset, maybe rather than in talking about it in terms of Lone Rain, or talking about it in terms of spirituals, right? That that there's the appeal to the natural world is so you can really, because you just can't, there's a whole range of structures that would exclude black people from being able to enjoy or understand or recognize the beauty of long rent. Just like there's a whole bunch of stuff about white sociality and socialization that would make it impossible for them to understand or to appreciate the beauty of Light and Hopkins or something like that. But the sunset is this other thing, you know. And so there's something heroic about it, and then there's something really common about it, you know. But it's really important that he can say that he feels that, you know, that he can say that he loves that, and that's a good thing about Du Bois. I mean, when it's important to read people who don't suppress that love in their work, even if they don't necessarily always openly declare it, you know. And so yeah, I mean, he's lovable for that.
Well, I think that's a wonderful note to end on. Universal love. Have a wonderful evening. Thank you both so much.